Welcome to another Explainer. Today we're unpacking a truly fascinating phenomenon where pop culture has spectacularly, and I mean literally right out in the streets, collided with how people actually protest in the real world. Now, if you've looked at any footage of global youth protests recently, you might have noticed a very specific recurring symbol flying above the crowds. It isn't a traditional national flag, and it's definitely not some historical revolutionary banner. It's a cartoon skull wearing a straw hat. Specifically, it's the Jolly Roger of the Straw Hat Pirates from the mega-popular anime and manga series, One Piece. Today we're exploring a rigorous socio-political analysis of how this fictional emblem became a real-world anchor for dissent.
Okay, let's dive into this because I know exactly what you might be thinking. A cartoon pirate flag at a serious political protest? Honestly, it's completely understandable to feel a bit of skepticism here. I mean, at first glance, it kind of looks like just a playful exercise in fandom, right? Like young people are treating serious political movements like a weekend cosplay convention. But the research we're looking at today argues quite the opposite. This isn't a joke to the people flying it. It is a highly sophisticated appropriation of a symbol. What we're seeing is a fictional narrative providing a much-needed moral vocabulary for people who feel like their real-world institutions have just completely failed them.
And to see just how widespread this really is, we just have to look at the sheer geographical and political diversity of these protests. As you can see here, in Indonesia, it was raised against corruption and performative patriotism. Over in Nepal, it flew during uprisings against social media bans that actually ended up toppling the government. In Peru, it signaled resistance against pension reforms. And all the way in France, it was displayed during massive demonstrations against austerity. So, despite vastly different local grievances, literally spanning from Asia to Europe to South America, this one specific symbol unites them all. It's basically become a visual shorthand for an entire generation that feels robbed of a future.
To really understand why this is happening, the paper we're looking at introduces this really interesting concept of a clean symbol. You see, for Gen Z, who are the first generation to grow up entirely in the internet age, traditional political identifiers are often viewed as pretty compromised. National flags, partisan banners, they carry this heavy baggage of history, broken promises, and entrenched ruling dynasties. The protesters aren't choosing this pirate flag because they want to be literal pirates on the high seas. They're utilizing it because it offers a totally clean slate. It transcends local ideological divides while maintaining a crystal-clear moral orientation, which is defending individual liberty against an overreaching, totalizing state.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the number 80. This refers to Indonesia's 80th Independence Day. During the massive protests there, the government demanded that citizens display the national flag as a show of patriotism. But instead, protesters hoisted the straw hat banner. They essentially argued that their national flag was quote-unquote too pure to be flown in an environment so tainted by political corruption. It was a satirical yet deeply serious act of cultural whistleblowing. By choosing the pirate flag over their own nation's flag, they highlighted a massive rupture in the social contract. They were signaling that the state's symbols had become entirely detached from the actual welfare of the people.
Section 1. The World's Government Allegory, Fiction as Political Infrastructure.
To grasp why this specific flag resonates so deeply, we really have to open up the Trojan horse of this fiction and look at the socio-political allegories inside the One Piece universe itself. Because it's right here that protesters are finding a mirror for their own real-world frustrations. The primary antagonist in the series is a global hegemony literally called the world government. And as the source paper analyzes, this organization operates on a philosophy of absolute justice, where maintaining order justifies literally any atrocity. In the fiction, they erase an entire century of history and annihilate islands of scholars who try to uncover the truth. The researchers draw a direct, very neutral comparison between these fictional atrocities and the actions of modern real-world authoritarian regimes. States that ban books, scrub digital records, and persecute academics who challenge state-sanctioned narratives. To the youth flying this flag, the fiction maps perfectly onto real-world suppression.
But it goes deeper than that. The mechanism of control isn't just military, it's heavily economic. The series features something called a heavenly tribute. This is a massive, mandatory tax that member nations absolutely must pay to remain part of the quote-unquote civilized world. If they can't pay it, well, they lose their human rights and are essentially left to starve. The analysts behind our source text compare this to real-world debt traps set by international financial institutions or exploitative aid conditions imposed on developing nations. For young people facing crushing inflation and impossible housing crises today, this fictional debt trap feels incredibly familiar. In both the fiction and the real world, the cost of maintaining global elite power is effectively externalized onto the absolute most vulnerable populations, basically turning the basic welfare of the poor into a crime against the state.
Section 2. Billionaires and celestial dragons, the extremes of elite power.
And this brings us to what is perhaps the most politically charged allegory explored in the source material: the ruling class. In the series, the ultimate elites are called celestial dragons. They are the descendants of the world's founders, and the paper notes they represent the extreme, logical conclusion of hereditary wealth. I mean, they are entirely unproductive. They don't innovate, they just consume at a scale the paper describes as Versailles times 1,000. They literally wear bubbles over their heads to avoid breathing the same air as commoners. It is a brilliant, albeit totally grotesque, visual metaphor for the physical and social insulation of the ultra-wealthy from the lived, daily realities of the working class.
And this brilliantly illustrates the paper's next big point. The analysts deeply examine this by comparing these fictional elites to the modern global billionaire class. On one side, you have the celestial dragons who have absolute legal immunity. Literally, if you cross them, a top-tier military admiral is instantly dispatched to wipe you out. On the other side, the real-world analogy points to oligarchs who have achieved a sort of too-big-to-jail status, wielding superior legal access. Where the fiction shows open human trafficking and quite literally hunting games for sport, the paper links this to very real public anger over Epstein-style systemic abuse and exploitative labor. This comparison really highlights a shared, profoundly serious public frustration with untouchable elites who just seem completely immune to the laws that govern everyone else.
Section 3. The philosophy of resistance. Normal people versus entrenched power.
So, if the world feels like it's run by this untouchable, entirely insulated elite, how do normal people even respond? Well, it is so fascinating because the protagonist crew is profoundly apolitical. The captain, Monkey D. Luffy, actually straight up rejects the title of hero. He famously states, "Heroes share their food, but I want to eat all the meat." It's this incredibly simple, almost childlike expression of wanting individual autonomy over a sense of collective, formal political duty. They don't have a grand, sweeping manifesto. They don't want to conquer the government and become the new rulers. And ironically, that exact lack of political ambition is exactly what makes them the perfect, accessible symbol for normal, everyday people who are just completely exhausted by traditional political ambition.
Let's move to and see how this builds into something even bigger. This lack of political ambition actually translates into a highly powerful ideology of direct action. Because the crew isn't bogged down in endless bureaucracy or red tape, they bypass useless political channels entirely. They don't wait for a mandate or a vote. At Arlong Park, they fight simply to reclaim a friend's dignity. At Enies Lobby, they literally declare war on the entire world government just to protect the freedom to know history. And at the Sabaody archipelago, the captain straight up punches an untouchable elite in the face simply because that elite shot his friend. For frustrated modern youth who feel that traditional political avenues are either rigged or entirely useless, this model of unfiltered honesty and immediate direct action against injustice is incredibly appealing.
The narrative's power also stems from something researchers identify as liberation psychology. You see, many characters in the series carry the very heavy burden of inherited trauma and systemic oppression. They've been told by the state for their entire lives that their very existence is a crime. To fight back, they must achieve what psychologists call critical consciousness. Achieving critical consciousness simply means they stop believing the state's narrative that they are worthless, and they actively reclaim their own erased histories and identities. This is a profound, incredibly empathetic parallel for marginalized groups in the real world today who are fighting not just for some high-level political reform, but to literally heal from systemic oppression and reclaim the narratives that have been silenced by those in power.
All right, let's bring this right back down to earth and look at the timeline of how rapidly this symbol actually diffused globally. In August 2025, it anchored the Indonesian movement against political perks. Just a month later, by September 2025, it was draped right over the parliament gates in Nepal. Also in 2025, it marked massive resistance to pension reforms in Peru. The paper notes that for a population watching their democratic institutions hollow out in real time, traditional revolutionary figures often feel, well, already defeated. But this mythological framework of the Straw Hats provides the absolute ultimate antithesis to doomerism. It injects a desperately needed sense of optimism that is required to sustain long-term street movements, especially in the face of brutal state crackdowns.
To summarize the core thesis of the paper we've been examining today, the Jolly Roger has become a symbol of real-world resistance because it embodies an uncompromising, fierce defense of human dignity. It reminds the viewer of a fundamental, almost forgotten truth: the consent of the governed is the only legitimate basis for power. When institutions completely fail, and when consent is replaced by pure, unadulterated coercion, resistance isn't just an option, it becomes necessary. The flag flying out there in the streets is a vivid, striking reminder that freedom is not simply inherited, it's something that must be actively defended.
So the crucial point is this. We are currently witnessing a profound historical gravitation of legitimacy away from traditional institutions and toward narratives of moral clarity, even if those narratives happen to be found in a Japanese anime. It leaves us with an incredibly powerful, provocative question to consider today. What does it actually say about the health of our current, real-world political and economic institutions when an entire generation feels they must turn to a fictional cartoon pirate crew just to find a reliable blueprint for justice and moral clarity? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a completely new lens through which to view the changing face of global dissent.